Hey, this is Christian Buckley, and I'm coming to you with another MVP Buzz Chat interview, and I'm here with Tim Warner. And Tim, why don't you introduce yourself and where you're from, what you do, a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing, Christian. First of all, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, Tim Warner is my name. I can't tell you how many times people have said, Tim Warner, Time Warner. And I say, well, you can feel unique. You're about the 10,000th person who said that. But I'm originally from Syracuse, New York, but I've lived in Nashville, Tennessee for the last 20 years or so. And I've been in IT for about 20 years now, actually. And I've specialized of late in the last handful of years in automation, and now especially I've kind of hyper-specialized in Azure.
Okay.
I've always been a Microsoft specialist since the very beginning, but I've also worked in the industry with Linux. I've supported Linux servers and Linux desktops and Mac OS environments. So really, long story short is, I'm basically an IT generalist. I love everything. So I work full-time as an author for Pluralsight, developing computer-based training. That sits squarely in my professional passion, which is the blending of information technology and education. And this Azure thing has ramped up to the point where I have people asking me for my expertise. So I've got a little Azure cloud consultancy on the side. And as a trainer, that's especially nice to have my hands in the industry as well as in the classroom. Really can't have one without the other.
So, I mean, so you're cloud and data center management MVP. Mm-hmm. When you have people come to you and ask for help around Azure, I mean, kind of like what are the areas? I mean, do you do like an Azure 101? Like, how do I get started? How do I utilize this resource? Mm-hmm. Like, what do people come and ask about? What are they interested in doing?
Yeah. Generally speaking, the clients that I work with in my engagements are looking to me for, they'll come to me because they like the way that I explain the technology. It makes sense to them. And almost universally, they're in a situation where it's coming from above that we've got to, for some reason or another, start to move some resources or deploy applications from scratch in Azure. Now what?
Yep.
Or maybe they've already done it and given it their best effort, and they're afraid that they've made mistakes along the way. Mm-hmm. So they look at my training with Pluralsight and they think, well, I understand the way this guy explains things. And it's amazing that I've had to do very little hands-on work for my consulting clients. Maybe that's one of the beauties of IT consultancy, especially with architecture. You can make suggestions and let the customer do all the heavy lifting. Right. But no, that's the education piece with Azure is so critical, because almost universally, there's this thought, we've given it our best effort, we've lifted and shifted some VMs into Azure. We may have, to speak to your expertise, we may be trying to do single sign-on from on-prem into Office 365, or we're using SharePoint Online, and we're afraid that we've got vulnerabilities, security issues that we have open and we don't know about it. So teach us. So my consultancy is every bit as much about knowledge transfer as it is in nuts and bolts IT work proper.
I could see how there's, because a lot of people, find their way into Azure, and myself included. I was like, I'm using one aspect of it. I have no idea the broad range of the other things that are out there. Mm-hmm. And with the constant barrage of innovation, of Microsoft adding and changing things and modifying it, and I mean, I certainly need a refresher just to go in and walk through, and I mean, I almost like need just even for my small business, like somebody come in and do like an Azure tuning. Here's what you're doing, this would be more efficient. Your fees would be lower, or, hey, you're not taking advantage of these three things. What are you doing here? So do you do a lot of that kind of thing with clients as well?
Oh, yes. Yeah, sanity checks to make sure that they haven't missed anything important from all those aspects, just like you said. Hidden, quote unquote, hidden costs. What are we paying for? I have a good example just from the other week. I was asked to look at a client's environment, and I discovered a whole bunch of the operations management suite, or OMS services, that were activated and being paid for each month. And this was a big surprise to my customer. Another administrator or maybe a consultant that they had worked with in the far past had thought it was a good idea to turn on these services. And the meter had been running on them for N number of months, and they had no idea. So I was glad that I was able to help them save some money right off the bat. And, with VMs, if you don't need to run the VM all the time, hey, did you know you can use Azure Automation to schedule VMs to shut down and start up on a schedule? Oh,
Yep.
wow. We've just saved ourselves 50%, of what
Yep.
we were paying, this kind of stuff. That the cost aspect is highly satisfying.
Well, and I think right there, I mean, like this has been a problem with, early on, some of the messaging, just, hey, move, get rid of the on-prem servers and move things over there. The problem with that is that the way that you're utilizing your on-prem environment, you can't just lift and shift whatever that over to Azure, the cloud in general, and run it the same way. It has to then be optimized for that, because there is that transaction cost, the calls that are being made, and can be a lot of those things need to be more efficient, so that, just from that cost, that standpoint, but also that organizations that go and do the lift and shift and then complain about some of the performance issues around that. It's like, again, the way that you have it architected, it's not set up to utilize it in an optimized way.
Yeah, absolutely. I stress that a lot in my training and in my consultancy. How you approach your IT infrastructure on premises, the paradigm is fundamentally different in the cloud. I have clients who just assume, because it's all they know, that if we want to use Azure as a disaster recovery site, then we should build out multiple virtual networks, and we want to try to match the on-premises network infrastructure as much as possible. It's like, no. Keep it simple, number one. You don't have to do a pure replication, The ability to hyperscale, think of SQL Server clustering and all of that overhead, and then think of, say, in Azure, you've got Azure SQL Database, where 2 clicks of the mouse and you're geo-replicating your database elsewhere in the world, and it's just done for you. I mean, the scale and the things you can do in Azure with just a line of PowerShell are just almost unthinkable to do on-prem.
Right. Well, it's funny being so I was at Microsoft at the beginning of what is now Office 365, and it was Microsoft Managed Services or Microsoft Managed Solutions, depending on who you ask. But MMS, which evolved into BPOS, which is the Business Productivity Online Services. But as we talk with clients as well, I mean, even as we were going kind of setting that up, even on the back end. So what is now Office 365 is that a standard capacity planning for that standard system. Like, it was a crazy number of servers, the physical servers to support these. Now, granted, enterprise, but for like a 5,000 seat customer, it was like 12 to 15 servers. Crazy, because we didn't have the data to be able to know what does this actually going to look like in a real, like, we need to keep it, here's the fake Microsoft word, performant. We need to build it where the majority, 95% of the time, we're using 5 to 7% of capacity, but then these spikes and they're out there. And that's what the cloud, enables. But you've got to make sure that it's architected, you constructed your solution to be able to take advantage of those benefits.
Yeah. I feel compelled to say this. You obviously know this already, but the huge wake-up call, I think, for some businesses is understanding that when you're consuming services like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, all the Office 365 stuff, they're providing data availability, but they're not providing a lot in terms of disaster recovery. In other words, you still need to back up your data.
Right.
At Microsoft, that's not part of their responsibility and the shared responsibility model.
Yeah, and I know that there are offerings on solutions like Office 365 that are around there, that it is done automatically. But when you have it on Azure, I just heard this again this morning where somebody was talking about leveraging Azure, was talking about compliance, and said, well, if you're using Azure, then you're compliant. Like, no,
Mm-mm.
You can have a compliant technology. Like Microsoft is compliant with how you're defining compliance in the first place.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But they are compliant with the areas where they need to be compliant in offering this. But just the nature of you as a customer using that platform, using that technology, as soon as you touch it, it may not be compliant for you and your business.
Yeah.
And so that's why you need to make sure that, depending on what solutions you have built, what you're doing, that you then go and ask those questions. Well, we have an out-of-the-box compliant solution. We're using Azure, we're using Office 365, we're using whatever it is, things that you're hosting up in there you've developed. But then is understanding what your compliance, your security compliance regulatory requirements are, ensuring that the way you're using it is also then compliant, which could mean creating new policies and procedures, buying third-party tools for monitoring, auditing, the backup and recovery, as you say, like a lot of those things that there are capabilities within the platform, but then you need to make sure, does this do what I need to do for me to be compliant?
Yeah.
It's amazing that I have to explain that to some clients, but I do a lot.
Right. Yeah. It's not, the cloud can take on almost a mysterious aspect, and you just think that it just works and it just does stuff, and it isn't always the case. I want to give a shout out to the Microsoft Trust Center to your viewers and listeners if they're not aware of it, because Microsoft has completely documented all of their industry regulatory compliance attestations, and they deep dive into how-tos where they show you what Azure features map to different compliance requirements and actually step you through how to use them to that end.
Yeah, it was a huge gap 3-4 years ago. They have done a fantastic job. Yep. I talk about that a lot. And again, they're constantly adding to that. So it is if you need to understand, I ask this for clients that then bring up the fact of the trust issues with moving things to the cloud. Right. They say, well, I don't know that it meets my security or compliance. Like what are the requirements? These standards, these different certifications, be like, okay, have you looked and see whether Microsoft has those certifications? Then again, it's the matter of whether you are applying it correctly, you're leveraging the technology that you're compliant with how you're using it. But the network, what Microsoft provides, if it's like, hey, we are ISO, we are GDPR, we are whatever the standards are that are your requirements. Like they say they do it, they've got it documented.
Yep. Yeah, and actually related to that, one of the most valuable things about my MVP award is having direct access with the various Microsoft product teams to get heads up, under NDA of roadmap stuff, but also to be able to ask for motivation and clarification on what is out there. I've learned so much from them, and hopefully I've been able to add some value to their day as well.
Yeah, and to say too, that they're not infallible. I mean, at the MVP Summit, like I brought up, I went from a conference out in Branson, Missouri, and I went straight to Redmond, Washington to attend the MVP, the annual summit, and brought several questions from this friend of mine working with a very large Midwest customer, and got an answer from the product team that was incorrect. It was their understanding of it, but they didn't realize that there was actually a hole. There was a little workaround that's like they weren't aware of. Wow. And so brought it to their attention, and they're like, thank you so much. And they came back like a week later with an official answer for us. It's not yet. I'm not giving details because it's still not out there. So it was under NDA, but they authorized me to go and talk with the friend and this client and give them some guidance. But you're right. I mean, it's great to have those connections and be able to have those conversations. I would argue, however, that any customer can go in through like the Microsoft Tech community, through user voice, through other channels, certainly participation in the GitHub efforts, and provide commentary and interact. And Microsoft is dramatically changed from the decade ago when I worked there, in that they are very invested in participating daily in those. In fact, it's part of job descriptions with some product and engineering roles that they participate in those channels.
You know, that really inspires a question. I want to interview the interviewer. So what do you think happened that resulted in the new Microsoft? What was involved in that sea change in your experience?
Well, so I look, I know that it's a much more complex answer to that, but I put change in the top leadership and Satya Nadella coming on board and a couple other longtime executives. Won't get into the detail.
Yeah.
I do have a little bit of animosity with a couple folks because I thought they just screwed things up in a big way. They're no longer with the company. And that made a huge difference. I mean, Satya's, I have my perspective. I've got friends that are, much more senior than I was in there that, that also had, feedback with the top leadership team, presented to Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, and some of the feedback, which just, again, I think confirmed some of my experiences at the lower levels. And so much of that has changed now, where it's a culture of listening. It's a culture of the whole one Microsoft movement of the, because historically Microsoft, product owners, like you own a feature, you own, features within a specific build around that activity, and it's very detached. I used to go to Microsoft R&D lectures and presentations where internally they say, we're working on this. And inevitably, questions were asked like, hey, this product team is working on something very similar to what you just described. Like, are you talking to them? Like, oh, weren't aware that they were doing that. Like, what? And I think a lot of that is changed where Satya's first keynote at the partner conference, so 4 years ago, where he talked about needing to look at customer problems end to end. Customers don't look at a feature. They look, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. I'll be in the screen here. And Microsoft may do this portion and this portion and this portion, but there's these gaps. And if they don't do it, then they need to make sure that they support what customers need for that end to end. That it reflected poorly on Microsoft for not taking into consideration these other areas. And Satya said something, sorry, and I go on the diatribe on this because it's something I talk about once in a while, but is that he said, our goal is to create, I'm paraphrasing, our goal is to create the best software out there. And where we don't have the best solution, we should integrate with, partner with those that have the best solutions. That attitude was the turning point, I believe.
Yeah, I echo that 100%. That's been my observation and experience. Microsoft looking at competitors as potential partners. And that's not always reciprocated. I'm thinking of Amazon, VMware, and Apple, but in many cases it is reciprocated.
Yeah, and it depends what it is. And I look at, and you can't knock a company for looking at and doing the math and saying, we don't believe that it's in our financial welfare to then go and have the partnership. There's got to be value both sides, but agreed. Yeah, it's an interesting space. I know there's a lot going on. Well, listen, Tim, just to wrap up. So, what's the latest of things that you're working on, and how can people get in touch with you?
Okay. Well, I'm in the middle of a big initiative that Pluralsight has going with Microsoft. We're doing a bunch of Azure courses along all the different personas, the IT pro, the developer, the architect. So those courses are publishing. You can get to them at azure.com if you go in their training section. You can get them at Pluralsight website, pluralsight.com. Those are actually free courses. You don't have to pay anything for those. So you could find my contact information at the Pluralsight website. Just look up my name, Tim Warner. Or on Twitter, for instance, I'm Tech Trainer Tim. My personal website is techtrainertim.com, easily enough. And I look forward to connecting with anybody who wants to connect.
Well, thanks a lot, Tim, for your time. Of course, we'll have a summary blog post that'll have a lot of the links as well. If there's anything else that you'd like to share within that, I'm happy to provide links through that. And thanks a lot for your time today. It's great to get to know you, to talk to you, and hopefully we'll see you soon at another event. You ever get out to Salt Lake City? I'm in the home of Pluralsight.
Yeah, I was just going to say Pluralsight is based there in South Jordan, I think is where
Yep.
we're located
Yeah,
now.
it's about 10-minute drive from my house here. But yeah,
Cool.
there's I said I don't often go to the airport here in Salt Lake without
Mhm.
seeing somebody with a Pluralsight
Okay.
shirt. So
Yeah.
I've talked with execs and other things.
Huh.
I've met a couple times Aaron Sconard too, and
Uh-huh.
was connected on LinkedIn, but he's not been as responsive since prior to the IPO and post. I think he's been busy.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen that guy develop. I mean, he's been really inspirational to me to see him go from, because I've been with Pluralsight for a number of years now,
Mm.
to see him go from a startup founder, well, originally a tech trainer and
Yeah.
a
Yep.
developer, to a startup founder, now to this CEO of a public company. Yeah,
And
he's
he's a
done a heck of
genuinely nice guy, and he
a.
does a ton with
Hmm.
the community. It's great to see that. So
Yeah.
yeah. Well, hey, Tim, thanks a lot for your time, and we'll connect with you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Christian.